are listening to the Christian Ghetto Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Christian Ghetto Podcast. And it's been a bit, but I like to do this podcast when I actually have something interesting that I want to talk about, or a guest that has said something interesting and has agreed to come on and talk about it. And one such occurrence happened recently with a mutual of mine, with Dimes, and he wrote an article, and I forget now whose actual podcast he was on, but he was talking about something that he calls first principles. And I thought, because the notion of the foundations of culture, the role of religion and faith, especially the Christian faith in culture formation, is something that's very close to my heart. I thought I would have Dimes on and we could kind of talk through some of this and hopefully learn some things and maybe deepen understand and maybe even question some of the things I do. And just for people's interest's sake, on the seeking the hidden things side of things, Dimes is the one who is responsible for the new visual intro to my my Seeking the Hidden Things recordings. So thank you for that, Dimes. I love the work you did there, and welcome on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it was myself and a videographer who I work with. We've done quite a few intros to various podcasts, but you're a dream client to work with. Let's just say that. And so it didn't take 90 revisions to get there. And the interview you were just referring to, I believe it would have been on Disgraced Propagandist show.
That's the one. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
That was one where we got to a lot of stuff. It was kind of meandering. Those are the talks I like. And I think it's based off of the same Substack article that we'll be referring to today, which is, I believe, Winning Was Never Enough. And that was a speech that I delivered at an event back in December of 2024.
Yeah.
And so it was
I'll link that
in
the notes for people.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's well worth reading, and it's a good piece. And so maybe I'll just let you. I like it
because so many of my articles are just very dense and schizophrenic. And this one, it was written to be delivered. And so I wrote it in a way that's meant to be read by people, which is wildly different than the rest of the other stuff I published.
So, yeah. And so maybe just I'll let you lay it out kind of for people. But I think that if memory is serving me right there, the article is framed in this idea of, we live in this kind of deracinated culture with no grounding. And we kind of free float as a culture, on reason. We have no authority. And there's this hunger to ground society again. And this is where you kind of bore down to this idea of what you call first principles. And I found it very interesting, sort of where you end up landing it. So maybe you can lay it out for the people and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I'll start by setting up the piece itself. And the original germ of that article was these two books that I read back to back, and I covered them on my show. By the way, if people notice that my volume is going down during this, it's my mic. For some reason, it just rejiggers the volume setting. So I just caught it doing it now. Anyway, the point, I read these two books side by side, covered them on blood satellite. One was this book titled Archaeofuturism, and the other one was Reflections on Violence by George Sorel. And they were kind of telling the exact same story. Archaeofuturism was the story of the French New Right, because Guillaume Fay was a member of that, and he was explaining its downfall, or in his words, how it became compromised. And George Sorel, in Reflections on Violence, was describing the syndicalist movement, similarly, how it fell apart and became compromised and was defeated. And I found the stories shared a lot in common. And without going too deep into them, the common thread was that they could not survive negotiations with power. Now, if you view this French syndicalist or any syndicalist movement, a far left movement, what you might call a Marxist movement, as a true revolutionary movement, he was making the argument that it can never negotiate with power. It must always attempt to destroy power, perhaps even replace it. I argue, as does Martin Gurry, that no revolutionary movement can really replace power. It has to become something else before it does that. But its real strength is in critique and destruction. But he had said, the downfall of the syndicalist movement was it caused all the violence, it made its demands, it was widely popular, and then it was at the table with power and is eventually defanged and absorbed by the power. Some people count that as victory. Your leftist policies were absorbed into the mass. Similarly, with the New Right Party, the French New Right, he saw it as compromising itself to appeal to the mainstream, to appeal to a wider audience, and it stopped being a truly revolutionary party. In his words, it had to critique power. If you're anti-system, you must be truly anti-system and propose an alternative to the entire system, which it might sound grandiose, but that's what it is. And so I took that common thread and followed it that, if you really want to win, if you are a true dissident, if you are a revolutionary minded person, and there's many different revolutionary minds, of course, we don't all agree in this space. Maybe you're a Christian nationalist, but you need to view winning as something more final. Winning isn't just seeing the politician give lip service to some of your talking points or your ideals, or winning isn't just the mainstream adopting what you believe to be some version of what you had said, because that will become compromised and you will be defanged in the process. So how do you actually define winning? And so that is the title of it. Winning was never enough. Like, you must view your victory as a true victory state. And maybe the mainstream appealing to your talking points is a moment of weakness. That's the signal that you can keep going. Don't just rest on your laurels. Don't just say the fight is over, right? Because the very machine that was persecuting you a week ago didn't just about face. It didn't just learn from its mistakes. This is really an old leftist talking point too, when you speak of the superstructure. Even Curtis Yarvin speaks of this in The Cathedral, whether or not you agree with him. He's kind of describing the same type of machine, that it will not tolerate a threat to it. Any critique of the system that is permitted within the system actually strengthens the system. I'm not going that far, but there's something to it, that anything that a system truly sees as a threat, it will try and crush or absorb, which is actually what we're seeing right now in our space.
Oh, you dropped off again.
Sorry, as so many of our talking points are absorbed by the mainstream, and we say, "Yay, yay, we're winning." Well, are we really winning? Can we? Let's look towards next
again.
Week. Sorry, I don't know what the fuck it's doing this. All right, so I just gave you a lot there. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I generally tend to agree. This is one of the areas where, with Yarvin, I tend to be structuralist, largely coming from the writings of Jacques Ellul, and his development of the idea of the technological society. And then also you can layer that with the Italian Catholic philosopher Augusto Del Noce, who argued that revolutionary Marxism decomposed and was absorbed by bourgeoisie capitalism in the form of progressivism. And then it became the idea of overthrowing the system and then moving into the new revolutionary utopia kind of disappears. That religious side of Marxism disappears. But the idea of instantiating utopia is now going to be done by means of the managerial state. So then we will progressively engineer society step by step through managerialism and through technocracy to achieve the perfect form of human civilization. Once we've sort of allowed it to iterate enough. And then the revolutionary aspect of Marxism, Del Noce says, gets turned towards the enemies of progress, which are traditionalists, those that resist this kind of progressive change. So anybody that's interested in past and so forth. And so, and Del Noce actually argues as well, too, that both modern post-Nietzschean streams, whether it is fascism, communism, or liberalism, all in some sense have a revolutionary, reactionary strain where they want to sweep away the present order in order to instantiate a kind of utopian world. The fascist wishes to instantiate a kind of perfect version of the past, and the liberal Marxist progressive wants to instantiate a utopian future that has yet to be conceived. So, but that there's and this notion that you say of being co-opted, I think is very, very important, and people don't understand. This is something that Ellul argued in The Political Illusion, that the managerial state cannot be reformed, and that any attempts to reform it just make it stronger. And and he details the reasons why for that. But it's, if you make this system, because it's geared towards consistent outcomes and efficiency, if you make the managerial state, or what you would call the modern state in any of its forms, whether in business or in government, if you make the state apparatus, managerialism, more efficient, you just make it stronger. You don't actually weaken it.
And that's what I found so interesting. I think a lot of people find interesting about the work of James Burnham and others. It's this very 20th century and 21st century awareness of what the managerial state is. And this fits very neatly into elite theory. This fits very neatly into the Juvenalian view of power, where power is concentric circles. You have the center of power, which might be the state, the monarchy, what have you. Then on the outer periphery, there's the people. But a lot of people forget about that inner circle, the intermediary power. And that's really what, just to give him a bit more credit, that's what Yarvin's talking about. I don't see him as the originator of this idea, but just one flavor of it. But he makes people ask, what components are in the system? So it's not just the government, it's not just politicians. The managerial state kind of exists on the periphery of the center, but then within the intermediary, you have the priest class, you have NGOs, you have the media, you have all these things that work hand in glove with power, but might not be obvious in a very 19th century view of power, which is people versus government. So people are forced to think more systemically about what power actually is, what the targets ought to be, and how you can be co-opted, because it's not necessarily meeting in a room with the president and shaking a hand. It might be doing deals with intermediary billionaires to change your narrative. There's lots of ways power can be compromised. And the one thing I like about leftist writers and Marxist writers, I'm not a leftist, I'm not a Marxist, but they take a very careful eye on what power is and how it flows and how it functions. And you can get very abstract when you go down that road, obviously, but it makes you view power and control in less rigid terms. I think that can and has been appropriated by the right, by traditionalists even. So unfortunately, that's kind of what this was about, this article, which is a very 21st century idea of like, what does winning look like? What does control look like? And this is all in the interest of forming a group, to advocate for your interests, whatever they might be. So if we can figure out what our heading is, if you can figure out what the win state actually looks like, then you can craft a strategy around that. But a lot of people lack a strategy because they lack a heading. They don't actually know what they're doing. And we can get into group dynamics, because I think in one part of that piece, unless I'm mistaken, I have it pulled up, I think I mentioned Wilfred Bion as well, which is, you can spend a lot of time talking about Bion and psychoanalysis. I deal in a lot of topics that you're not supposed to talk about, especially within our political milieu. I don't just denounce psychology. I don't just denounce the over a century of, Marxist investigations into power. I try and look at these things. I do this on my other show with my friend, the Prudentialist. We tend to look at some of the more fringe works emerging from the post-left and seeing, is there anything in here that makes sense? We cut through a lot of the esoteric theory stuff and say, like, but what is in here that is valid? Really, it's to answer the question, why does Marxism seem to still have such an audience? Is there something buried in there that is, if not correct, then at least relevant, or at least a relevant critique? And I think it behooves us to understand why certain ideologies seem to work or seem to have lasting clout, despite the fact that they've failed spectacularly in so many other realms. So, when you read these articles, you will see, like I even mentioned Foucault at one point. Nobody on our side likes Foucault. Certainly I don't. But in reading Madness and Civilization, I talked about this with my buddy Jay Burden. about Foucault specifically. It's like, can we do you have the confidence and also the experience and background to actually tell which part of this should be just thrown out, but find that pearl of something interesting in there? Anyway, I'm rambling again, but I gave you.
No, it's fine. And this is why long form podcasting is so nice, because you can ramble a little bit. Well, and this is the thing that drives me nuts a little bit too, is, so I'm talking into my hand now, is that I'm also a thoroughgoing postmodern, right? So my philosophical core in many ways comes out of hermeneutics and semiotics, the idea of, like, how does meaning translate, right? And so I am very much a Gadamerian, like, Hans Georg Gadamer, in terms of, the recognition of the problem, the hermeneutical problem, and the problem of meaning, and the problem of grounding knowledge and so forth. That's the nice thing too, is I veer off into things like Jung and Marcia Eliade, and Walter Ong is another big one for me. But I think there's the quote unquote canon of political works, but if you stick to the canon of political works, you end up very much just sort of mouthing orthodoxies, and that's always a dangerous thing. And when you were talking about, sort of the approaching this idea of, like, what does winning look like in terms of the current administrative system that sort of runs everything. And one of the things that Ellul notes is that managerialism, that what we would call managerialism, or the technocratic society, Ellul calls it technique, because he argues that we tend to get fixated on the devices and the systems and so forth. And Ellul argues that more fundamental is that technique is a way of thinking about the world and the way of addressing problems. And this is the one thing I think that most people on our side don't fully grapple with, because technique basically only allows one type of, like, it only allows solutions. In other words, the kind of things where we can break the problem down, analyze it, abstract it, and then develop a solution to our problem. And so the idea where I get to is, as soon as anyone starts talking about, like, okay, what's the solution to the problem? I know you're already working for the system, in a sense that you're captured by the system because you're captured by the way of thinking that underlies the managerial world. And so this is why, in a sense, you can't, in a managerial world, there is no such thing as what we might call traditional or conservative policy, because in order to have conservative policy, you have to basically take a conservative or traditional way of doing things, abstract it, rationalize it, and then turn it into a product, a system, or a machine, which then fundamentally breaks it. And this is why Ellul says that if you want to use, say, propaganda to further the cause of Christianity, you essentially destroy it in the process. But you have, and there's this whole sense of that. But in the modern world, your people who come to church are confronted everywhere by propaganda. And so if you don't address propaganda with them, then they will become seduced by the propaganda in the world around it, and you're powerless against it. But if you use propaganda techniques to ward them off from the propaganda machine of the machine, you, in a sense, destroy Christianity in doing so, right? And so this is the kind of bind that you're caught in terms of dealing with power, is that in order to grapple with the modern administrative system, the question is if you're within the system and you're going to try to grapple with the system living within its totality, you, in a sense, become almost immediately co-opted by it. And the system just sort of absorbs you and turns whatever thing you have into just another aspect of the system. Yeah.
And this is a relevant line of inquiry, because you'll notice, especially when it comes to Christianity, but even more especially Catholicism, is that people will try and find political solutions within religion. And by which I mean, there's this interesting movie that I don't like, but I saw it recently, and there's an interesting part in it. It was called Conclave with
Oh
Ray
yes,
Fiennes.
I avoided that one, but maybe
You should.
it's a give it a watch.
It's a good movie until it isn't. Right at the end, there's a twist that makes the entire preceding movie, it just stabs it in the heart. But there's an interesting idea in there where I'll try and explain it briefly. I won't explain the entire movie, but beginning, Pope dies, natural causes. It's set up as sort of a whodunit in a sense, trying to figure out what internal power politics are going on in the Vatican, because they need to vote on a new pope. They need to go to conclave, and all the cardinals will vote, and it needs to be nearly unanimous. And there's 3 contenders, and there's this interesting idea in there that nobody wants to be the pope, and this is a line delivered by Stanley Tucci's character, and no one wants to be the pope, but everyone there has their pope name picked out in the back of their minds, right? Because
you dropped off again, Times.
Oh, sorry. But everyone in every cardinal, in a sense, has their pope name picked out, right? Because they do secretly want it. But there's this idea.
They all have their guy.
Yeah, or if they want to be them deep down. But it's really 3 contenders, right? There's the conservative one, there's the hyper-progressive liberal one, and they're kind of going at it. But then there's this dark horse who turns out to be trans. Spoiler alert, don't go see it. But the trans one makes an interesting speech, because one of the plot lines in the film, it's that there's basically an Islamist incursion in the Vatican. There's terrorist attacks going out all outside the Vatican and inside the Vatican during this. And so the Italian contender, the Pope, he's a more conservative Pope. He says we must wage war against the Islamists. And a lot of people listening would agree. And I do basically agree with that sentiment. But the good Pope, the one that we're supposed to like, he has an interesting take, which is it our job to fight the war against this enemy, or is our enemy war itself? And so, and I get why that would seem as a compromised position, but to me, that makes more sense for the Vatican. What is your aim? Is your enemy just this one? Is it this materialist war against Muslims, or is it against Satan? Is it against the mimetic virus? What Rene Girard would say, the mimetic virus, like Satan in the form of violence. So should our aims be higher than just this corporeal enemy? And I kind of get that, but the problem is, and I think that's actually more fitting for an institution as long-lived as the Catholic Church. However, what a lot of people are looking towards Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy for is an army to join to fight these immediate wars. You're looking for the religion to fulfill your politics, your regional politics. And you're hoping that could be the army you can join, because your nation's army has been seen wanting. But I think, like you said, the issue is that we're making almost managerial state demands upon an institution of religion. And we might look towards the Muslims, say, look, their religion is every single part of society. But I don't think, I think our aims can be a bit more segmented. I think they ought to be, because that's our natural state. That's sort of like a lower resolution solution to the problem. And that's not a very popular answer, I understand. But what do you think about that?
Well, and I would agree on this. And this is where, say, I have been, you pick up stuff in odd places, and Rod Dreher, of all people, in his book, The Benedict Option, talks about Václav Havel and his idea of, do the right thing. So I figure, since you can get a hold of Václav Havel's books, I figure you might as well just go read the man himself, right? And so Havel argues that you can get into this this dialectic with your quote unquote enemy. And he's absolutely right. And so there is a sense where if you're battling the communist and you become an anti-communist, he says your existence is now defined in this dialectic between you and the communist. And so you become this anti-communist, and then in many ways you become your enemy in order to defeat him. And this is a common observation that many have made. And so what Havel argues, and I don't know how successfully he was able to achieve it in life, but I think he's ultimately right, is in a sense that you need to refuse to play the game. And so the option is then to look for door number 3. And door number 3, he argues, is just simply do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. And if doing the right thing happens to bring down communism, great. If it doesn't happen to bring down communism, oh well, at least you can take solace in the fact that you've always done the right thing. And I think that he's largely right there. And so if you'll allow me for a bit of a lengthier explanation on this, there's a temptation in our Christian circles, I think, to want to instrumentalize the faith. So we can make certain observations about the Christian faith in a sense that this idea that it bubbles up from the bottom, doing conversion one-on-one, is largely mistaken. Okay, and this is kind of the American sort of, you have the free mind, everybody has to freely come to the gospel. That traditionally what has happened is that in societies that have gone over to Christianity is that certain key elite tastemakers will convert to Christianity. And because of their conversion to Christianity, those beneath them socially begin to imitate them, and it begins to sweep through society. And it's seen as the means of acquiring social success. Now, that's not in a sense why you come to the faith. Like, the elite person who converted probably did it, hopefully for noble reasons because they were convinced, so forth and so forth. And so we try to reverse engineer that process by saying that, well, if we just grab all of the elite positions through force, through violence, by working the technological system, we can then, by seizing those positions, reinstantiate Christianity in society. And I think in some ways that's fundamentally mistaken, because it comes back to Havel's, that it's sort of that Alulian thing. In sort of doing that, you end up destroying the essence of the Christian faith to begin with. So in a sense, if you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it's the right person doing it, it will have tremendous social effect. But at all times, you need to be doing the Christian faith because it's the right thing to do, not because you're doing it towards certain political ends. Now, if you're successful in doing it for the right reasons, then it will have a sweeping effect across society. And then once it has this sweeping effect across society, because until Christ returns, you still live in a sinful world, you still have to deal with things like crime and violence, then you have certain questions that you have to answer in a Christian community about, violence, war, protection, or whatever, that stem from being the dominant member of society. But until such a time, you are likely going to be, as the episode of this podcast, a ghetto community that is struggling to do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, and then allowing the results of that to take care of themselves. And this is why I found your whole idea of fundamental principles so interesting, because I think it dovetails nicely into this thing of doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, regardless of what the outcomes of that are.
Yeah, if I could just add to that point you just made, we know what it looks like to see Christian reduced just to techniques or rituals. See, a good example would be what you see in America, right? And I'm not trying to lay into Protestantism in any sense, because I think this phenomena affects all Christian denominations equally, but you will see sort of perverted versions of Christianity. It is the church, and I used to live in Toronto, so I used to live by these churches with the pride flags flowing, with the female pastors, and they're all talking politics. They're all anti-Trump. They have the crosses. They have the stained glass. They pray. They do all the things you're supposed to do in a Christian church. However, what they really believe in is progressivism. What they really believe in is progressivism adorned with the regalia of Christianity. So they actually don't even believe in Christianity. They just think that adopting Christian symbolism will be more expedient for their progressive values. So to your point, it's like, do people actually believe in Christianity, or has it just become a technique? Is it just a technique that you need to adopt to win something? And so what we're really trying to get to, and this is more to the point, what are your first principles? What is it you actually believe? And when I say first principles, we say this on the show all the time. And some people will hear that and will substitute their own meaning for it. But if I could explain it very simply, it's what values or principles you have that are non-negotiable. And different groups could have that. It doesn't just need to be Christians. And it's to the point, there's this interesting book, to phrase it another way, called The Network State. And it's very much an NRX style book. It's very much in the sort of Peter Thiel sphere of let's figure out how to systematize religion. It's kind of transhumanist. It's very blockchain oriented, but the whole book is about how you could create a breakaway state, a step-by-step plan about how you and your group could actually become a state through your online network. It's an interesting book. You don't need to necessarily agree with all of it to find it interesting, but there's this one part in the book. He says how to establish your state in the initial stages, and it's to draft a constitution. And I think a lot of Americans will probably agree that having a simple constitution is better than a very complex constitution like we have in Canada. That actually opens it up more towards very litigious interpretation of it. But he said, have a one phrase commandment. This is the one phrase that unites you all to the point where if someone doesn't affirm that phrase or they disagree with it, you cannot be allies. So it might be Christianity equals good. They have a very Reddit way of explaining the book, but Christianity good. Or if you're a white nationalist, for example, it'll be white people good. Or if you're a black nationalist, black people are good. That's something where if we can't shake hands on that, or you try and fog the issue or debate me on it, we're not friends. You're subversive. And that's the baseline where if we can't agree on that, we can build on that. But if we can't agree on that, then we actually don't have a fucking group. So, and the group could be anywhere from like 10 to 50 to a community size group. But you need that very simple affirmative foundation. And in America, and a lot of the problems you see in politics in America, but also within our space, what we can call broadly the right, is we're still debating on first principles or trying to get to the root of what these things are, especially when you get into racial politics about like, well, what is the race? Like who counts in that? And what do we do with those who don't affirm that? You know what I mean? Like, it's not to say that we're more prone to bickering. We're actually trying to dive into the root causes and the first principles of what we actually believe in the interest of forming these groups so we can advocate for ourselves and ideally because people talk about parallel societies and breakaway communities all the time. And this is and retribalization. You hear that word a lot. And all we said was, okay, let's focus on that practically. What's your 5-year plan? How do you do that? Because anyone can say we need to retribalize. Anyone can say we need to unify for our own interests. But okay, how do you actually do that right now in 2025 with the tools at your disposal? And here's the trick. You can't reference anything that was at the turn of the 20th century as your model, right? So we start from the first principle of that and try and find out what your first principle actually is. And it's what is inarguable, at least one thing. It's easy to get more first principles as you get older. Like, I'm in my mid-30s, so I got a lot of first principles. I got a lot of people I don't want to fucking work with, but maybe that works against me. You just get bitter and mean as you get older. All you young listeners, you'll get there too, by the way.
Yeah. Well, at the same time as in theory, you kind of mellow out at the same time too, and recognize there's certain things that you'll draw a line in the sand for and not put up with anymore. But there's also a lot of things that you realize that there's a lot more ambiguity in the world than, not so much ambiguity, but there's a lot more mysteries in the world that you're much more comfortable to live with. But this is what really attracted to me because it gets at the contrast between, because there's this question of, okay, so we live in the technological society. And I've described this to people as what we would call the tank problem. Okay, so, all right, you're done with technological society. You're going to go out and you're going to start your own little Amish community and you're going to live like it's in the 1800s. Well, that's wonderful for you, right? Well, you have to realize that the only reason why the Amish can do that is they're really no threat to the American state. And so they're allowed to live their peaceful, what's the word, where the nonviolent society and they're peaceniks and so forth, and everybody kind of leaves them be. But you guarantee you that the moment that the American state deems them to be a threat, they'll squash them because Absolutely. That's just what you have to do.
Because that was the criticism against the libertarians originally many, many years ago, which is we just want to be left alone. You eventually spend enough time in that pool and you realize, well, they won't leave you alone. Not on a long enough timeline, at least within a few years, but then your survival is assured insofar as you can make yourself less and less threatening and more like some underclass, and you're running towards being underclass. And that's totally anathema to what a lot of people in our space would want to do, because they are, virile and righteous and ambitious, and they don't want to just make themselves, they don't want to run towards being serfs. So that's a hard sell for a lot of people. And if they're being honest, they might say, I just want to live on a homestead. But but you're actually trying to install a multi-generational project to accumulate sovereignty. And that's the whole point of the network state. The end point is, how do you become a nation? How do you become an entity that, I'm trying not to curse that much on this show. I have respect for the Christian ghetto, but you want to make yourself into a group that can't be fucked with. How do you become, and part of that is the threat of violence, but part of that is just economic sovereignty. Like, how do you become a nation within a nation that it's more difficult to roll you over than it is just to deal with you? A good example would be the cartels in Mexico. We can get to that later, but there's examples from around the world of what that looks like. But the goal, remember, isn't just to make yourself as powerless as possible. You actually want sovereignty for you and your group or your people or whatever. And that will eventually gain the negative attention of whatever the state is. So we have to solve for that.
Well, and this is why you end up with a number of dynamics, because I'll loop back to what I was talking earlier. And this is one of the problems that Americans' Protestantism, even conservative Protestantism, is facing, is that they hitch their wagon to a certain version of the American state as their protection, right? And so this is that thing that Schmidt noticed is, the protection obedience binary. So you have a group that protects you, they provide prosperity for you, so you then are obedient to them. And so there was a certain segment of the Christian community that hitched its wagon to mid-century American dominance. And that included embracing, market capitalism, the whole, free trade, all of the myths and the features of the 20th century, late 20th century, post-World War II version of the American state was
also, let me just say, this is what my friend Ryan Turnipseed would say the Mormons did with the CIA.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Keep going.
No. So then you have this thing where, you then shift and adapt your beliefs towards protection. So if you want to avoid that dynamic, as you say, you have to be sovereign. Now, the problem is that unlike the Mennonites, you recognize it to be sovereign, as an image, you can say, well, assembly lines are terrible and we don't want it because they're evil and that's technology and technology corrupts us and we become subservient to it. So we're not going to build tanks. But the problem is that the American empire and most other, modern states have no such qualms. They've got their tanks, they've got their, so you then still have to figure out a way to grapple with the tanks that they have. So you have to somehow make peace with a level of technological sophistication, even if you don't embrace its utopian ideals. You have to find a way to grapple with and deal with and neuter the tank threat of your enemy. Otherwise, you're going to then be in this protection obedience binary where you are subservient and obedient and have to do obeisance to the particular demands of the larger state apparatus. And so parallelism is great. And it gets you back to this kind of sense of fundamental, of first principles. How do you form the state? But there's a whole series of exigencies that you then have to grapple with. Like you say, how do you provide an economic system? Where's your energy coming from? Where's your food coming from? Where's your protection coming from? And you can think you can have a little village of, Mennonite adjacent type of community where everybody's kumbaya. But that's fine and dandy as long as you don't represent a threat to anybody. And this is perhaps some of like the idea of the Christianity's being a ghetto community, that you exist on the fringes of society and just hope not to be noticed, right? But the problem is that if you're successful in spreading the gospel, you begin to break out. That ghetto community grows to become a threat. And then once it becomes a threat, now you face certain dilemmas of, is there a certain segment of the community that have a calling from God to protect the rest of the people? And that means then getting their hands dirty with violence. And I would argue, and that's something I've done here, is that I would argue that, yes, that is a viable vocation from God. And you can grapple with the theology of that, but that's part of what you would call the kingly aspect of the gospel, is to protect your fellow man so that they can worship in peace and not have to get their hands dirty with violence.
No, you raise a very, very good point there, which is, do you measure your effectiveness of sovereignty by being just a miniature version of that which persecutes you? Because the end of the network state, just to go back to that example, is you eventually accumulate enough geographic capital. You have an area that you live in that you can actually become a nation within a nation. But does that work against you? Is that just something that can be taken from you? Or in the 21st century, is the global American empire, or they call it the GAE sometimes, but whatever the Western state apparatus is, the NATO superstructure, does it even make sense to try and be a smaller contender within that? Or do you need to take a different form entirely? Which is one thing that I take from what you're saying, which is to be truly parallel, do you need to be something supra-state? And arguably that's what religion can be, but maybe it needs to change its form, because people, like I said, are looking for ideological solutions from religion. But, but
frankly, to be honest with you, Dimes, I've always conceived of it in terms of, the very traditional, you buy your land, you get your homesteads, you build your community from scratch. But what you're hinting at is, if you take the idea of a ghetto community that exists on the margin of society, that why couldn't it be a kind of fifth generation warfare type of situation?
Yeah.
Where you're landless, and that works, and it makes you actually more resistant to the predations of both the rewards and the punishments of the state apparatus, which is everywhere globally still, because you operate on the fringes of society. That's a very intriguing idea.
And I have the shape of this. I don't have the exact details, but I'm trying to wrap my mind around something that can be victorious, and trying to reconcile it with the reality that for any group or community to be effective, it does need to have geographic proximity to itself. Like if you're building,
you have to be close to each other.
Yeah. And that's undeniable. So in some sense, there needs to be this geographic aspect to it.
You have to have communities.
But is that the end point? That some people say, we're going to take something that's digital and bring it to the real world. I'm trying to think of what does a better synthesis of that look like. And again, this is just me thinking aloud, but this is where I'm at these days. It's a funny example. We were talking about this before the show started. I was doing a lot of reading in Mexican drug cartels and narcos culture. And there's one element of that a lot of people find very interesting. And it works its way into all the media about this: Breaking Bad, Sicario, any cartel show. It's the narcos religions. And it's sort of I would say a satanic perversion of Catholicism, but it is a Mexican branch of Catholicism with its own saints. There's Malverde, who's their patron saint of the narcos religion, who was a real guy, a real narco who died, and they just worship him now, almost like a pagan saint. And then there's also Lady Death, who is what it sounds like. It's a fucking grim reaper lady in a dress that they pray to. And I was reading this book called El Narcos, but there's a lot of media about cartels because we're so fascinated with it. In fact, that's one of the main arguments. People say cartels don't exist, but I won't get into that right now. These religions exist. And I would call them closer to pagan religions, because people prefer these saints because they can make offerings and wishes and leave them fucking vodka and cigarettes and shit. And they'll take care of their enemies. You see the more like pagan rituals, but they're popular not only with the narcos, but also lower class Mexican civilians. These shrines, it's not the biggest religion, but it's becoming more widespread. And you'll have Malverde or Santa Muerte side by side with Mary and Jesus, right? And they see it as all just one part of it. Now, what's interesting is, what are the cartels? The cartels are non-ideological. They're not political in any sense. They're an emergent capitalistic phenomena, but they are politically relevant. They are culturally relevant, and they're very relevant to the identity of Mexico. It's so relevant that they birthed their own fucking religion. And so you have this non-state, non-ideological entity that births something out of it that I think is bigger than the state itself. So the ultimate outgrowth of that interplay between culture and capitalism, all this other shit, is this weird, fucked up religion that could only have emerged from the geographic area of Mexico. But here it's like a 20th century thing. It's a new thing, kind of like Scientology. But you see how this is different than Scientology. And it appeals, like you had said, to the people in the ghettos, to the underclasses, but also to this new nobility, the nobility of the narcos, the people who seem to hold real power, at least comparable to the state. Like they are truly an emergency, but like a very different sort of thing. They're not a revolutionary party either. So I just love that, because you have a new, not a mythology even, but an actual religion that people pray to as something that could outlive each particular cartel, because cartels are rising and falling and rising and falling. We have this new thing that has the ability to be bigger than maybe even Mexico itself.
Yeah. So this emergent kind of pagan offshoot of Catholicism becomes the binding force which unites the cartels as you say, as they come and go. They all participate. And that's interesting, like you say too, that the common man then in this protection obedience binary adapts his own like Catholic faith to this, in that sense corrupting it, but he's doing it because he's paying obeisance to the powers that govern his life. And part of the powers that govern his life is this emergent pagan religion, and which is sort of a case study in some sense of how cultures develop.
And also to your earlier point about how Christianity developed, like it was the adoption of the aristocracy and nobility. Yeah, that's part of it. The widespread acceptance of Christianity had something to do with the elites adopting it, but it's also true that it was emergent from the people. It's a very holistic phenomena. In the history of the spread and the triumph of Christianity, like we talked about Rodney Stark on the show. We talked about Cochrane in Christianity, Classical Culture, an amazing work that I'm going to talk about with my buddy Prudentialist on that show, our sister show, Do You Even Read? There's a lot there. If you want to look into the history of the dominance of Christianity, it wasn't this, mythologized mass adoption. And once there was fits and starts and ebbs and flows, but you see how these things, and also how they spread also through the history of proselytization. Sorry, I always get that word wrong. And there's this other great book called, some people disagree with it, but I think fundamentally it's correct, of the Germanization of early medieval Christianity and how you would proselytize Christianity to the Germanic people. And
that's an interesting phenomenon, the transformations that occur there.
Yeah, and there's actually a synthesis.
If you've ever picked up, say, something like Roland, like 1200s, Roland is a good example of this. It seems very alien to sort of modern Christianity, but Roland is a really good example of that Germanic Christian synthesis.
Exactly. And you can tell the Germanic nature. The argument of the book was that the Germanic nature fed back into the church, into the early Catholic Church, and imparted a distinct Europeanness to the Catholic Church, which is, I think, why it resonates so much with Europeans, because it wasn't birthed in Italy, in the Vatican. It came from the East, in a sense, but by degrees, it took on a very profound European character. And the argument was that, because you would attempt missionary work all throughout the world. It didn't take in Japan. It didn't really take with the Jews. It didn't take very much in Africa. They tried a lot of places, but it seemed to take in very specific European tribes and whatnot. However, it succeeded insofar as it was able to adopt or interface with at least some of the existing social hierarchies and value sets. So the argument of the book was that as they succeeded in converting the Germanic tribes, you started to see Christianity itself take on some Germanic characteristics, like seeing Christ as more of a heroic figure. You adopted this Germanic idea of heroism, which isn't to say you adopted all their gods and whatnot, but you kind of adhered a bit more and popularized their understanding of the gods and the paranormal. And so what you see with the church is where it extends, it also synthesizes in some sense. It becomes dominant. Maybe it's a 70-30, but that's also the case of the English language as well. Whereas if you look at the expansion of the language throughout the world, it tends to get indigenized wherever it extends to, and that kind of feeds back into English itself. And that was one of the claims made by a lot of linguists, is that English lost a lot of its Anglo character the more it dominated the world, which is, in a sense, a problem of imperialism as well. You see that in any imperialist project. And again, I'm throwing a lot at you there.
No, but what's interesting too about this whole period is people don't really realize that Europe wasn't really fully Christianized until I think like 1300. When you get up into the Scandinavian countries, like it wasn't that it happened instantaneously. And one of the interesting transformations, as you noted, in Germanic societies, it had a twofold effect of restraining and giving purpose to violence that probably wasn't quite developed in the Germanic peoples. It was, violence and dominance, have always been part of the Germanic peoples in that regard. But it was really Christianity that allowed that violence to be transformed into something that was civilizational building.
Yeah,
and that's in a sense that it's the marriage of the Germanic and the Christian and the Christian that bursts in some sense the Faustian spirit. The only problem is that they very quickly lost control of it, and it began to eat itself very quickly, which is unfortunate because this idea of conquering the world and pressing out to the horizons has a very strong Christian bent to it in terms of converting the whole world is in a sense almost a quasi-Faustian idea. But if you take that with the Germanic heroic idea of conquering the world, marrying it to the idea of Christian conversion, you now almost in a sense have a match made in heaven where Christianity can in a sense, contain the worst excesses of Germanic violence while channeling its endeavor or channeling its energies to in a sense conquer the world with Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it gets run off because they can't restrain this impulse because they want to conquer knowledge and they want to conquer finances and they want to conquer technology. And Christianity by the 1700s isn't capable of containing that desire for conquest across all of these areas. And it begins to break apart and eat itself, unfortunately.
And that's such a fascinating conflict, is that the dialectical tension between the universalization inherent in the church, but also the particularism of those cultures that have informed it. And that, to me, one of the aspects of like Hegel that I like is that is the synthesis. We just live within that tension. Maybe that's a tension that never gets resolved. Perhaps we're just negotiating that for as long as we're going to be in existence, and maybe we're the only ones that can navigate that. And I wanted to just call attention to an interesting Substack I read. I did a episode on Real Secret Coffee Hours, which is my paywall show on this. And this, I said, this is just at the end of the episode. It's from this Substack called The Sea-Girt Citadel. The title is The Night, Death, and the Devil, Meditations on the World. It's very prose heavy. It's very poetic. But someone had sent it to me and they said, here is an interesting example positioning the knight, the figure of the knight, as an answer to the barbarian, which is a very popular archetype in our space, like the barbarian vitalism, the masculinity of the barbarian, the unhinged masculinity to rape.
The berserker.
Yeah. And so, but that is the only antithesis to feminization inherent in modern society that we have. So a lot of people default to that, but it was saying like, well, what of the knight? The knight was also a martial class. The knight, as you had said, was a more focused violence. It wasn't just unhinged violence. And the character of the knight, and you don't see this depicted in popular culture, really. We love the barbarian. We love Conan. There's a lot of pop culture acceptance of the barbarian, but the knight is never portrayed as cool or relevant. But the knight was also violent. The knight was driven. The knight wanted to reproduce, a lot of these masculine characteristics. But the knight, I think, is a bit more relevant to the modern Westerner because he did have an understanding of a higher power. He was Christianized insofar as he was also a martial class, but he embraced violence. He embraced the conflict. He was at war, but he's also kind of a lonely figure. He takes on the suffering, he stands apart. And I actually think the figure that stands apart resonates more with the Westerner than this sort of vague collectiveness of the war band. I just think that's sort of
like the holy warrior who, the shining example. The problem is that virtue doesn't sell, because as soon as you've got this archetype of the holy warrior, immediately you want to begin to test that and prod it and subject it to all kinds of tests and things to see, is he really as virtuous as it? Can we bring this knight down? And the drama of that internal conflict, of the corruption of the knight, seems to sell far better than the aspiration for virtue and the sacrifices necessary to attain it.
Yeah. And also there's something you mentioned, the underlying point that you're bringing up is the corruption of something greater by making it into a technique. And I've also explained that as the politicization of religion. But basically the core of what you're saying is very interesting. And I'm always pointing to these books I read recently, so forgive me if I sound pretentious, but the thing is, I am. So there's this book that I read recently called The Disenchantment of the World, A Political History of Religion by Marcel Gauchet. And it's, that sounds like a very highfalutin topic. The entire history of belief. Who would read that? It's only like 250 pages. How could you get to everything? And I think it's associated somewhat with the Tavistock Institute. I don't know for sure, but reading it has kind of Tavistock fingerprints on it. But it's explaining it almost from an atheistic point of view. But there's this idea in there that once you tried to combine rationalism with religion, which it had its own momentum in the West, that the moment you try and rationalize religion, you can, but you bring it into the realm of rationalization, which distances you from the hereafter, from the world of the paranormal, from the world of miracles. And there's this lovely idea that he repeats again and again in the book, that the more you can dissect and understand something, the more you have dominion over it, the more you control it. So I think that's what a lot of people feel now. And I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, because I'm a Catholic, but I wasn't raised in the church. I came to this later in life. And so the way I had to approach it, whether I wanted to or not, because I live in Canada, I live in a 21st century rationalized liberal world, I had to approach it from a liberal perspective. And this is what traditionalists like Evola and who was that guy? The guy who wrote The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times. Anyway, a lot of the traditionalists will say, like, it's impossible for you to truly apprehend anything traditional because you're locked in a liberal mindset. You're liberal no matter what. So even when you embrace traditional ideas, you do it from a liberal standpoint. And I don't really know how to break that. And the argument that Gauchet was making in the book was that, yes, we view religion now from above, but that means we're not subject to it. We're not immersed in it. It's just another toy for us. And what I find, and this is a very bold claim, but I think when I see a lot of people who are the most religiously devout, they have faith in the importance of faith, which is righteous and good, but I don't think they are immersed in their religion the same way an ancient person might do. Go back to the Bronze Age, go back to tribal societies where...
You don't even have to go back that far. You can just go back to like pre-Protestant Reformation in many ways. Well, or even not even that far back, even probably like 1700, you could probably still... The idea that the whole of your society, revolves around your religion. So, in a 365-day calendar year, you might have 100 saint days or religious festivals, and your whole day, you get up in the morning, you go to mass. Everything that you do, the most dominant architecture in your city is your church. Everything that you do is done around the rhythm of your religion and your faith. You eat, breathe, live, sleep of it. You live in a sacred society. And then in order to make money, of course, that's not very efficient to have 100 days off a year. So you have to dispense with all of that in the modern technical rational, where you put the power of technique to work to make money. And that has to all be dispensed with. And so you have to revolve your life around technique and making money instead of religion and faith.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're addressing the real problem here. And it's not a problem that I have a solution to, but it's, can you step outside of technique? Or, phrased another way, can you step out to truly immerse yourself in traditionalism or something outside of liberalism? Because people will say they're illiberal, they're anti-liberalism, they're anti-enlightenment. The argument he makes in the book is that the seeds of this go back farther back than the Enlightenment. If you think it's just this thing that happened with the Enlightenment,
oh yeah,
that's
no,
not really the case. Not you specifically, but anyone else, yeah.
Well, it begins even with the dialectic that gives birth to the West. You know, and you can see the seeds of feminism going all the way back to courtly literature, and you know the idea that a man has to resolve himself around women's desires. Right? It's all there in like the 1100s in the courtly literature. It's just people aren't paying attention to the fact that feminism goes back that far, like modern day feminism goes back that far, and the quote unquote woman problem or woman question goes back to like the 1100s.
It's funny on that. There's this really great book called Sex and Culture by James Unwin. I think
I've heard of that one. Yeah.
It was either released by Antelope Hill or Imperium Press. One of those two, I'm pretty sure. But it was published in the 30s. And James Unwin, it's an anthropological study of tribes throughout the world and different levels of civilizational advancement and whether or not they adhere to sexual morality. And he was actually drawing a correlation between a tribe's understanding of monogamy and chastity versus their level of spiritual attainment. And so he had multiple levels that you can progress through. Mm-hmm. There's the dead level, which a lot of tribes are at, which is they don't really see value in honoring the dead, period. People die, they forget about them. They don't communicate with the afterlife at all, or they don't have any way to interface with it. Now, they might have belief in gods, but their understanding, they don't have an interest in the mechanics of the spiritual. And so they don't have really many rites or rituals. But as you progress, then you have, oh, this person died, but they're important. So their spirit is still here. Okay, now you have an understanding of the connection between this world and the paranormal world or the world of the spirits. And then you start establishing certain areas where you build temples. But these are not everyone does this. And he was charting the correlation between, it seems that as they advance their understanding and their interfacing with the spiritual realm, they seem to understand the importance of sexual morality. And so the argument of the book was, if you kind of prioritize not just virginity, but chastity, if you're anti-adultery, if you understand the importance of raising your children, that is the mark of a more advanced tribe, right? And so I forget where I was going with this, but that's just an interesting thing about how you can sort of progress through your understanding of interacting with the spiritual world and how that correlates with your advancement otherwise. And just back to the main point I was making there before, the argument is made with Christianity that as we try and draw lines around the spiritual realm, we can control it more, but we distance ourselves further and further and further away from it, which is where we are right now. Like, we look upon the spiritual realm or even traditional religion as a distant thing that we're trying to grasp. And some of us want to grasp it. Some of us just adorn ourselves, like I said, with the regalia of it. But what are they really trying to, is their true religion Christianity, or is it progressivism?
Well, see, this gets into, and this can get you into all kinds of trouble in Christian circles, but I have long observed and gotten myself into trouble beforehand by arguing that the notion of systematic theology is itself the application of the same cultural forces that produce managerialism, but applying it to the Christian faith. So in a sense, you're rationalizing it. You're trying to come up with ever more, I don't know if it's necessarily sophisticated, but you're looking for the one true interpretation of Scripture to explain every contradiction or every mystery. Everything gets harmonized, everything gets explained, and you're looking for a definitive final expression of the Christian faith that is the most adherent to truth. And there's a lot of folks now who, in trying to restore Christianity, are looking at scripture almost like a policy manual. So in a sense, what we need to do is we need to, get back to God's truth, and we need to just interpret it faithfully and apply it properly and do this across society, and everything will be fine. And if you, and this is an overcharacterization, but you can see the same impulse as the liberal, in a sense of what we have to do is do our scientific research, figure out how society works, and then we can apply the right solutions across society, and we can fix everything that's wrong. And it's a very, very similar impulse. And it comes back to, are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, of the divided brain hat? And so there is this sense that when a human being is in balance, you have this intuitive side of yourself that's able to grasp not just physical reality, material reality, but also the unseen, the spiritual, the intuitive. And then you have this other side of your brain that takes this intuitive things and makes it useful. It systematizes it, organizes it, speeds it up. So that way you can make it useful for operating your life, building civilization, and so forth. And what McGilchrist argues is that we've gone so much down the path of this rationalized side of ourself that, you think like exercise, we almost don't use this intuitive side of ourself at all anymore. And as a result, we're making ourselves almost like autistically schizophrenic, because we're just sort of tilted to this one side.
Yeah. And what gets crazy is that, like you said, you're looking for religion to solve a utility problem. Like Christianity is not going to solve the mass migration problem. And the solution can't be, well, we just need to make a new religion, which is what a lot of people do. And you see,
or if we just find the right interpretation of scripture, then we'll have the path forward for dealing with the immigrant problem,
which is
correctly.
Treating scripture like a contract. It's like, see there, subsection
or a
B, here's
manual.
Policy manual. It's like, I zoomed in, and here's the part where it says I can do what I want to do politically. I'm like, that's not even the right way to look at it. I even saw an article or like a meme recently that says, did you know you can calculate the exact place and the exact date that Jesus was crucified? And then from there, the exact date where he died and where he died. I'm like, okay, does that make it more or less true? Does it make it more or less important that you could actually point to on a map? It's like, that's where he was, and here's what he said. And
does it even add anything?
And that's what a lot of people
to the importance of the gospel at all.
And that's what a lot of people who corrupt Christianity will do. A lot of the leftists, which is like, Jesus said this, which means he's a hippie, which means he probably smoked weed, right? They're getting into technicalities about which of their friends Jesus would be like. I'm like, that's such a low resolution view of what this is.
Well, and this gets back to that question of as you say, like first principles, Dimes, because I have argued that, in contrast to the technical world where everything is refined, abstracted, put into a policy manual, made into a solution, like you said, sort of what's that one thing, right? And I've argued that in a real living community in this regard, everybody can hold the basic ideas that bind the community together within themselves in memory, right? So everybody, in a sense, knows this is how we do things. This is the way we do things around here. And if something is wrong, the explanation is as simple as, well, that's not how we do things around here. You don't necessarily even have to justify it. You could say, well, God doesn't want us doing that, but we've interiorized that knowledge to the point where you're saying, yes, it originates in divine revelation. God gave this to us. But that's just not the way we do things around here. This is how we live, and we keep this and hold this in. So there's this idea that as a community, all the important things can be held in your hand. And so you have, Lul talks about sort of the pre-technological society use of technique, because law is a technique. It's a technology. And so the more that you can hold law organically in memory, the less technical it becomes. And so you take a few of these commands or ideas, and then a new situation crops up that doesn't quite fit the mold. The elders get together and they make a kind of judgment on it based upon sort of, this is the way we do things. In this situation, we take the limited tools we have, and this is what the ruling is. Now, in the modern society, we want to keep remembering all of these, writing them all down. But in an organic community, there may be no need to write it down because these basic core principles suffice. And maybe this event is significant enough that it stays in memory, and maybe it doesn't, right? But at the same time, you resolve it using these basic principles. And so this is kind of the contrast to that and the technological reality. And then you ask the question of, well, how do you break out of the well, what's kind of the things that the technological world really can't control? So you get to basic things like prayer, and in some ways like real community, sharing meals together. So there's all of these basic things that, in a sense, I mean, you could technologize, and people can try. Like, you can write a book, 30 things to do to make your family Christmas dinner a success. But everybody knows that's kind of a perversion of actual traditions.
Yeah,
right.
And you see a lot of the Jordan Petersons of the world. I'm not trying to criticize him too much, but they would try and psychoanalyze religion. It's like, well, you would say that prayer is important on a baseline level. He would say, well, let's look what prayer is. We can put electrodes in your brain and tell that when you pray, it stimulates this part of your brain, which makes you feel good, and things that make you feel good, you should do more good things. Like, that's like a Steven Pinker way of looking at it, which is, we're going to rationalize prayer with fucking brain waves, but you're trying to break ourselves out of that because, the criticism of a lot of these, I don't want to call them scientists, but scientismists, would be like, oh, God, can I put God in a flask? Can I weigh prayer? Can call God to the courtroom? Oh, if you can't call him to the courtroom, then he doesn't exist within law. So why does it exist anywhere? Why does it matter? And so, yeah, like, we're trying to apprehend, I use that word a lot, I apologize, but try and grasp something that truly exists outside of these systems, because these systems won't permit that to exist within them. And that was, what Gautier was talking about, which is that as you become more rationalistic, you begin to dissect these ideas. And in dissecting them, you kill them, you rob it of its spirituality. So yes, you can systematize these religions. You can make them more technical or adhere them to technique, but then it won't be what you want it to be. You'll make politics out of the Bible. And then it's even more easy to corrupt, because you can still have a rationalist enter that and pick that apart with their tools. Because
in some sense it's divorced from the original, from the power of the stories. And that would be the sense too of that question of, so how do you break out of the system? Well, in a sense, you just go back to reading the stories again.
Yeah. And that's what I was talking about with Conclave, which is, as much as I dislike that movie and that character, what is the role of the church? Is it to fight Muslims, or is it to fight Satan? If you had to pick one, as politically uncomfortable as that might make it, because people want, they join Eastern Orthodoxy because they want it.
It's a biblical idea that you are in a battle with the evil one. You are Christ's, frontline soldiers, maybe perhaps, in a battle with the evil one to liberate people from their bondage to the evil one. That's kind of the struggle that you're in.
So people don't like the universalization of politics. I understand that, but there's some areas where we should have attempts at universalizing these very, very large problems. And that's what I think some of these religions attempt to do, and trying to politicize it, I think, just once again dissects it with rationality and makes it into something that's not only ill-equipped to solve the problem, but is even more corruptible by your foes.
Well, and to get at this idea that you're a parallel community, you might say a ghetto community, is sort of fifth generation warfare type of stuff. But you can exist as a church community. You don't even necessarily have to have a building, but you can get together and you can share meals. You can get together, and read the word, or you can do it on your own. You can pray, but you can exist as a real, organic, functioning community alongside of the technological world, in a sense of just practicing doing the right thing, by approaching sort of, in a sense, as you say, Dimes, just sort of focusing down on what are the fundamental principles, in some sense, that lay beneath the abstracted realities of the technological. What is the stuff that the technological society has abstracted, rationalized, and then technologized? Because there's still a real organic reality that lives underneath, that's still there, that can be lived in a way that isn't technologized and rationalized and abstracted. It can be lived in a real organic way. You can pray as an antidote to the technological society. You can worship as an antidote to the technological society. You can gather as communities as an antidote to the technological society. And you can also do things that when somebody in the community is without a job, they lose their job, you can help them keep their house and their mortgage, and you can help find them work in the meantime till they find something better. And you can, in a sense, live apart from the rewards and the punishments of the regime to the degree that is possible. And you can obtain, even alongside living in this ghetto alongside of the regime, you can maintain a fair degree of sovereignty over your life. This is something that Ernst van Zyl talks about a lot in terms of South Africa, is that the state has taken all of these things and you can reclaim them so you can teach your own children. You can do that. That's okay. And you can support each other and find work for it. Now, you might not be working for a Fortune 500 company and you might not drive a Ferrari, but you can have a really good life and you can have friends, you can have intimacy with God, and you can have a relative degree of freedom from the predations of the regime if you're willing to live that kind of first principles, authentic kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, that's something my co-host Judas, ironic name, of course, but he would adhere more towards that living. He's trying to redefine what the good life is outside of just a high-paying job or materialist ends, and he is succeeding pretty well at that. I'm bougie though. I'm a fancy boy. I like expensive sushi. I like things that are truffle flavored. So we'll see how I fare out in the collapse, right?
Oh my word, that's hilarious. Yeah, I was just tweeting something out. I managed to acquire through, Canadian, it's a multicultural society. I did some business with some folks, and as one of the things I got given a gift of some domestic like high-end domestic market, like Chinese domestic market teas that basically had to be brought over from China. It just so happened when I was doing a deal with this guy that he was coming back from thing. He says, I was just back from China. I have this wonderful tea. He says, why don't you take it as a gift? And I went like, whoa. And, somebody online asked, is this tea better than the stuff? And I said, yes, it's actually much better than stuff. But if we kick all the Chinese out, how am I going to get my high end?
Keep one. Everyone's allowed to have one.
My high end domestic, Chinese domestic market teas that are just night and day different from the teas that you buy here.
Even the Nazis would keep one Jew around because bagels are good. We like bagels, so.
Oh my word, guys.
I like deli sandwiches. Look, yeah, I'm really getting it all in as I'm sure we're finishing up soon.
So if somebody has survived this long, I'm sure that they are not going to take offense at that. And this is something. This is actually with Peg online that I've joked beforehand. One of the things that's wrong with political correctness is that you eliminate all the ethnic jokes. And part of the thing of ethnic jokes is you both get to laugh at yourself and laugh at each other in a way that diffuses tensions between different groups. It allows you to keep your identity. It allows you to embrace your identity. It allows you to laugh at yourself, and it allows you to be laughed at, and it allows you to do the same about others.
Also,
and
the very
one of the
real
things the problem is we don't tell ethnic jokes anymore.
The real fear is if we stop telling Polish jokes, Polish people might stop existing. Like, I don't know what they do unless that's, I think, a third of their GDP. It must be.
We speak the Polish people into existence by speaking ethnic jokes.
Poland.
Oh my word!
It's been known that Poland is a tulpa that we just create through political incorrectness. There is no Poland if we just stop looking at it.
If Poland falls in the forest, nobody hears it.
Yeah, falls in the forest. What happened?
Oh my word! I'm sorry. There we go. I don't think we've entirely exhausted, but it's been a rambling conversation, and that's been good. I've really enjoyed this, Dimes. It's been fun to chat and to just sort of noodle around this idea for a while. And but if anybody is really diligent and they would like to find you online, maybe just give a plug into the kind of things that you do, other than providing intros to probably several dozen now of well-known internet personalities who've had their intros to their videos and so forth prepared by you. But other than doing that, what are the kind of things that you do?
Yeah, just so people know, we're open to more intro and trailer work. The recent one we did was we worked on Martyr Maid's trailer for his war, the German People's War, which was.
No, I didn't know you did that. That was good.
Yeah, that was proved to be fairly controversial, but he likes that, and it's a wonderful documentary. And he was also a dream to work with. Find us on bloodsatellite.ca. It's a show, weekly show. We talk about all kinds of weird, trippy topics. Politics, and we're a funny show, or at least like to think so. And you can find all the episodes there on the site, bloodsatellite.ca. Also, the Substack in question that kicked off this whole discussion is the Vanguardist Journal. That's vanguardistjournal.substack.com. It's also at vanguardistjournal.com if people want to follow it off of Substack. But that's where all my writing goes. And that's all the main ones. I got my Twitter handle up on here on screen at Legally Ironic, but I don't want to avalanche you with too much stuff. That's fine by me. Sorry, I think it's cutting out again. Did you hear all that? It starts
good.
Cut out during my plugs.
At Legally Ironic, and that's and people will find you there. So, yeah, subscribe. Look Dime's stuff up. It's different, and his show's fun. And if you're looking for an intro to your your video, your podcast, Dimes is a place to go. So he'll get you hooked up that way. Anyways, thank you, Dimes. It's been a real pleasure. I'm really glad that we had this conversation.
Oh, I loved it, dude. This was great. We talked about so much good stuff. I love talking. We had another conversation on an X Space not long ago. I love that one too. And so I love talking to you.
Yeah, same. Very good. And have a good one.
You too.
Seeking the Hidden Thing is delighted to have Axios Fitness Coaching as a sponsorship partner. JD is one of our guys and wants to make you fit for what's coming ahead. He offers a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning. Axios offers standalone training programs as well as individual coaching options should your needs require something more specific. Click on either the image below or the link in the description. Both I and JD thank you for your support.